Welcome to The Spotlight, the podcast where veterans and military spouses connect and share how their military experience has transformed their lives and their businesses. Here's your host, Bob Louthen.
Hey, this is your host, Bob Louthen, founder of the VeteranCrowd Network, the network that brings veterans and veteran-led businesses together with each other and the resources they need to prosper. And you are tuning into The Spotlight. Hey, everybody, this is Bob Louthen, host of The Spotlight on the VeteranCrowd Network. We're going to be diving into some books again today. Our guests are Pete Fretwell and Taylor Baldwin Kiland. Taylor is a Navy veteran, and together they have co-authored the book, Lessons from the Hanoi Hilton, 6 Characteristics of High Performance Teams. Pete, Taylor, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Hey, I'm going to start out, Pete. Can you tell me how you and Taylor met and how you collaborated on the production of this book?
Sure. I was studying for my MBA, and one of the assignments was Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, in which he talks about the Stockdale paradox. And it began to intrigue me what James Stockdale had done as a leader within the confines of a prisoner of war camp. I started playing with that a little bit, writing a little bit while I was continuing my studies. It was Memorial Day 2005, I believe. My wife is, I jokingly say, one of C-SPAN's 3 viewers. She walked into my office while I was studying. She said, "You got to come see this lady." So I walked out and I see Taylor Baldwin Kiland. She is on a live broadcast on C-SPAN with a number of POWs as they recall their experiences. So I jot down her name, finally reach out to her, and Taylor, take it from there.
So I got a cold call from from Pete around that time frame, or maybe it was a couple days later, and he said, "I saw your C-SPAN appearance where you were talking about a book that you wrote called Open Doors, Vietnam POWs 30 Years Later. And I noticed that you have relationships with a number of the POWs." He said, "I have an idea for another book about the POWs. And it's about the leadership incubator that these men created in the Hanoi Hilton." He says, "I think there are some really unique leadership lessons that these men can impart with business people, with people going through personal and professional struggles." And I said, "Oh gosh, I'm not sure I have another book in me." But he needled me, he cajoled me, and he convinced me that we should do it. So we started by writing a feature article in Naval Institute's Proceedings magazine, a professional and academic publication, a very old one. And we received wonderful feedback from it, including from General Jim Mattis, who asked us to come and meet with him in his office to talk a little bit about the lessons that we had uncovered in our initial study. So we were encouraged, and we decided to write an entire book about the topic. And it took us a couple of years, probably. It came out in 2013, so it took about 7 years. And it was a wonderful journey. And I think we were able to shine a spotlight on the tremendous leaders, and there were more than one leader within the Hanoi Hilton. I think we shined a really great spotlight on the leadership capabilities, the leadership performance of the men in this, as I say, a very unique place, a crucible of leadership.
Absolutely. You know, I'm going to mention Jeremiah Denton and Paul Galante. Paul is a friend and colleague, certainly a friend of the VeteranCrowd Network. Jeremiah Denton actually went to school with one of his sons, Mike Denton, and you know, both just incredible individuals. Pete, you mentioned the Stockdale paradox. Tell everybody what that is in a nutshell.
Well, James Stockdale was a student of Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, and he basically conceived the concept that you have to brutally confront your reality. In other words, you cannot mince words with yourself or anyone else about the tough situation you're in. And he convinced the other POWs that this was true. You cannot say, I'm going home before Christmas, because it may be many Christmases. If you say that, you're going to put yourself at risk. But at the moment you say, I'm not necessarily going home this Christmas, you have to have optimism and faith in your end result, that you will achieve your mission, that I will return home with honor. And that is the paradox of brutal reality about where you are, brutal honesty about where you are, your reality, coupled with unwavering faith that you can still achieve your mission if you stay focused.
Taylor, and you guys wrote at length in the book about, the torture and the awful conditions that these men went through for years. And, pretty soon, all of them would break under the pressure of torture. The goal was not to, but they found ways of coping with it. And they also accepted that behavior because Stockdale understood that it was important to keep the team together, right? Can you talk a little bit about that particular element in the book?
Stockdale talked a lot about the fact that there was a distinct difference between failing and being a failure. And I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but he spent a lot of time instructing the men under his charge that they should resist to the best of their ability. But frankly, none of the information they had in captivity, even after just a few days, was worth much intelligence value.
Mm-hmm.
So it certainly was not worth risking their life and dying for it. So Stockdale made it very clear that each one of the men under his charge should resist to the best of their ability, to their breaking point. But if they did break, if they did give up information other than what the code of conduct dictated, that they shouldn't beat themselves up about it. As he said, I think the quote was, "There are no virgins in here."
Mm-hmm.
But what he did say is that when you do break and you do give up some information, make sure you come back and confess. Share what it is you told. One, for two reasons. One, because of the information that you can share with others as to what kind of information you gave them, so that everyone had this same foundation of information. But also, two, because of the cathartic value of sharing the fact that you gave up information, that you failed. And isn't that what confession is really supposed to do? Mm-hmm. It is supposed to relieve you of that burden. It is supposed to be cathartic. And so in doing so, he gave his men permission to do the best that they could, but also forgive themselves if they gave up, if they broke the code of conduct. And quite honestly, I think, and Pete can probably echo this, there were many who thought that the code of conduct was way too strict and way too literal. And there were some in the Hanoi Hilton that felt that, especially Stockdale, that this code of conduct should be subject to interpretation. Do you want to add something to that, Pete?
What we found in our research, Bob, was that there was a split between the Air Force officers and the naval officers on how to interpret the code of conduct. And Stockdale ultimately went closer to how the Air Force interpreted it, because he saw in that a path through in which he could find a way for his men to return home intact with honor and keep them from doing what had happened every war before that, World War II, Korea, and back into history. When you put POWs in a situation like that, the enemy tries to turn them against each other. And Stockdale found a way to hold them together to where they did not turn against each other, but helped each other find ways through to return with honor. And it was a profound discovery. He thought he would be court-martialed when he returned home for having interpreted the code of conduct that way. And he was willing to take that risk for his men. Profound.
they had an extensive communication methodology. The 5x5 tapping on the walls. They took great risk. Uh, Jeremiah Denton is noted for when they were making propaganda film, he's using, Morse code to communicate by blinking his eyes. Paul Galante, who I mentioned, cover of Life magazine,
Yes.
they had to airbrush out the fact that he was flipping the bird with both of his hands down below, but there were ways that these guys were resisting and winning, and I've even heard additional stories of the great risks that they took to save others who were in bad health, and sharing food, and just incredible acts of support and bravery, and they never lost that cohesion, right?
Really didn't. There were a few outliers, right, Pete? You want to talk about the bell curve that George Coker told us about?
Yeah, thank you, Taylor, for reminding me of that. I think for me, Bob, the quintessential summary two sentences that of everyone we interviewed, George Coker said, "You have to understand this was a bell curve like any other organization. We had 11 on the high end and 11 on the low end." And then he paused and he said, "And we managed to get all but two of the 11 onto the bell curve."
Hmm.
Think about that. 7.5 years, and they were working to get as many people on the bell curve as they could.
A lot of these guys are passing away now. I mean, they're approaching, their 80s and later in some cases. They still get together. Are you guys staying in touch with the POWs to this date?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm in touch with them all the time. Have
It
lunch, dinner. I volunteer with some of them.
is
Many
a
of
very active and impactful group of people
they
to
are, and
this date.
they're very close knit. Very, very, very close knit. And they still have reunions every year.
Honor, duty, service. At the Veteran Crowd Network, we're focused on our next mission, bringing veterans, veteran-operated businesses, and veteran service organizations together with each other and the resources they need to prosper. That's why we are launching the Veteran Crowd Rewards Program, exclusively for our individual and corporate members. Now you can save on travel, restaurants, goods, and services from brands you trust online and at over 900,000 locations nationwide. Find out more today at VeteranCrowdNetwork.com. If you are a veteran-operated business, or a VSO, consider the connections, the network, the benefits, the engagement, and success of working with other veterans again. The Veteran Crowd Network, you paid a lot of dues to join this club.
Hey, so we're talking with Taylor Baldwin Kiland and Pete Fretwell, the authors of Lessons from the Hanoi Hilton, 6 Characteristics of High Performance Teams. Can you pick one characteristic, Pete, of the high performance teams, and just share a little bit with our audience the lessons that you got from the POWs, and how a business person can take that and translate it into some success?
The one that comes to mind for me, Bob, is the first one, the mission leads. And there's a lot beneath those few words. Stockdale was in there for 7.5 years, of which he spent 4.5 in solitary confinement, cut off from the people he was leading.
And some of that in leg irons inside of a box.
Absolutely. Sam Johnson, who became a congressman from Texas, told us, he said, you would see Jim come out of isolation. He was stooped over, his hair was disheveled, his spirit was broken, and you would grieve for your leader. And 2 weeks later, you would see him shoulders back, head up, his command presence back in place, and he'd head right back into solitary forest. That has a profound effect. But the question is, how, when you're in isolation for 4.5 years out of 7.5 years, do you lead? And the answer is very simply, Jim Stockdale made the mission so clear, so straightforward, so simple that every person owned it, and he was allowing the mission to lead that organization when he was not there to supervise. Others stepped in, Jeremiah Denton, Robbie Reisner, right on down the line. They stepped in and said, this is what it means. And each person was responsible and accountable, as well as allowed to interpret, how do our rules of the road apply to this situation? What do I do?
Right. He made it so simple that he made sure that the organization would outlast his leadership.
He didn't expect to come home. He expected to die in the Hanoi Hilton. And therefore, he would imperative that he create an organization that was not dependent on him.
One later.
Do we have an accurate count even today of how many prisoners were in the Hanoi Hilton and a few of the other sub camps, and how many actually perished during their time as prisoners?
Well, 591 came home. We know a handful, and I can't remember the exact number, a handful died in captivity. But there's still many who are missing that I think authorities assume may have died in captivity, but
We still have no accurate count of that and haven't recovered the remains.
correct.
And I think it's important to note, Bob, that when we wrote about the Hanoi Hilton, we intentionally, just because of the need to keep the book focused on the Hanoi Hilton, we omitted a tremendous number of POWs who lived in camps in other parts of Vietnam.
Some in South Vietnam.
Absolutely. Being held by the Viet Cong, for example, as opposed to the North Vietnamese. And many of them showed tremendous courage and survived, but many, many of them perished.
Yeah, their mortality rate was much higher in South Vietnam. And I don't know this for a fact, but I would assume and I would assert that the mortality rate for the men held by the Pathet Lao in Laos was fairly high too, because we had very, very few men released from Laos.
Taylor, you are a prolific writer. I'm not exactly sure if I've got the count right, but let's say 18 books. Is that in the ballpark?
That's in the ballpark. Many of them are children's books, though, which don't take very long to write.
Well, maybe I would understand those a little better. My comprehension and reading level might be more age appropriate for me. Hey, you're working on a book right now, or actually just released a book called From the Sea to the C-Suite, and I have not had a chance to read it yet, but I want to hear about it. Would you share a little bit about what's the content of that book?
Sure. So that is a book that I ghost wrote for the CEO of Navy Federal Credit Union, who actually is a Richmond native. I don't know if you know that, Cutler Dawson. He's a retired Navy Vice Admiral, spent 31 years, maybe 34 years in the Navy as a surface warfare officer, had command of at least 6 ships, I believe 6 commands. And he retired and became the CEO of the largest federal credit union in the world, Navy Federal, in 2004. And over the course of his, he was there until 2019. So over the course of his 14 years at the helm, he quadrupled the size of the organization and turned it into an industry standard for customer service. And he took what was a really good organization and just turned it into a stratospheric, fantastic organization.
I'm a big believer that military experience translates to success in business. Lots of studies over the years about the leadership qualities and what they bring. So is that what's in the book? Because I'm kind of excited to see that somebody's maybe done a study of this.
Yes. He applied lots of lessons from his experience as a naval officer and applied them to Navy Federal. I think you would find his leadership philosophy and style to be very appealing.
So, I can almost give the stump speech. Why does the Veteran Crowd Network focus on veteran-led businesses? Well, they are team players. They can communicate, they can plan, they can organize, they can get groups of people focused on an objective and get them all working together. But these two things stand out to me: the heightened sense of ethics and personal accountability. Any of that in your book?
For sure, the heightened sense of ethics. He talks a lot about, doing the right thing
When nobody's looking.
when nobody's looking. He also talks about having your own North Star and making sure that you adhere to that North Star. And he modeled the behavior. He modeled the behavior, much like Stockdale did, for his organization. He never asked his employees to do what he was not willing to do himself. He talks a lot about, in the book, going to the deck plates. And that was not just a philosophy for him, but just a daily practice. He said too many times COs, manage by walking around, and then they retreat to their sea cabin and you never see them again. Well, I tell Cutler Dawson that he could never be on Undercover Boss, because everyone at Navy Federal knows what he looks like and knows him. He was actually questioned at a town hall meeting once. Somebody raised their hand and said, "Cutler, is it true that you know every single employee's name at Navy Federal?" They have 19,000 employees.
Oh my goodness.
And he chuckled and he said, "Well, it kind of helps that a lot of people in the branches wear name tags." He said, "But no, I do not know everyone's name." But what does it say about a leader when the organization's employees believe that everyone knows his name? He took management by walking around to an entirely new level. It was not uncommon for him to walk out of his office and just walk around and sit down at the cafeteria and start chatting with people, or go into the call center and sit down and listen, put on the headphones and listen to the types of calls that the customer service people were getting, or go into collections. Talk about a tough job, right?
Right.
When he got to Navy Federal, the collections business, the morale was in the toilet.
Mm-hmm.
He said that the leadership down there was pretty poor. So he put a new leader in place, and then he made a point of going down there every night around 7 o'clock and just giving them a little pep talk. And after they had a really, really good, profitable year at their annual, the Navy Federal has a big annual prom every year, and they all get dressed up in black tie and they go in prom. Cutler got up and said to the crowd, "We had a tremendous year this year, high profits, we've grown by X%." And he said, do you know why? You know who you can thank for our really, really good year? And they said, "Oh, the sales guys and the branch heads." He says, "No, you can thank collections."
Mm-hmm.
You can thank your collections department. And of course, the collections team is like jumping up and down, and we had buttons made for them. Have you hugged your collector today? Because at the end of the day, collections is about revenue generation.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't collect that earned revenue, you're missing out on a whole lot of business. So he turned around that entire department. But that's just one example of the type of inspirational leader he was.
I think one of the lessons we learned in the military was there are no unimportant jobs. And if the leader can let everyone from the top to the bottom understand how important their role is, regardless of what it is.
And to know what all those jobs are.
Right.
Know what all those jobs are. He told me a funny story about when he was a third-class midshipman. So in between his first and second year at the Naval Academy, he went out to sea for a couple of weeks on the USS Newport News, a heavy cruiser. And his first job was to trail a young sailor as he went around and cleaned the heads. Not a glamorous job, right? But all the heads got to get cleaned. So he said he and the sailor went into the men's head. They put a sign out that said, being cleaned, shut the door, lock the door. And he said he spent 45 minutes cleaning it. And then they were done, even though the sign on the head said, closed from 8 to 10, but they were finished in 45 minutes. And Cutler said to the sailor, "So what do we do now?" And the sailor said, "We lie down on the deck and we take a nap." He said, so we lay down on the deck of the head and we took a nap. He said, but clearly that sailor's boss didn't know how long it took to clean the head.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a lesson that he learned very early on. You got to know what every job entails. And you got to make sure that every person who's in that job is doing the right job.
That's right. Hey, let me ask this question in closing. Pete, what's in the future, near future for you? And Taylor, what have you got on your agenda here for the next 12 months?
Well, as far as books, Bob, the one that I would like to write, and I'm still trying to convince Taylor to actually, Taylor is the driving force behind getting something written. When we talked to Jim Stockdale III, the son of Admiral Stockdale, he basically, the first time we met him, just blew a hole in a lot of our research. He said, oh, much of what my dad did in the Hanoi Hilton, he learned on the farm in Illinois. It's like, say what? We hadn't come across that in 6 or 7 years of research. He said, when you think about farming and how the guy who's a wealthy farmer with 10,000 acres living next to the guy with 10 acres who's just getting by as a sustenance farmer, they face the same fire, they face the same flood, they face the same pestilence. And if they don't work together, if they don't cooperate, they both go down.
Mm-hmm.
Continue just giving the examples of how small communities in the heartland of America, farming communities, developed sets of values that are core American values. And he said, those are the things that got the POWs through. And I tend to think that there are farm values that are very similar to the military values you talk about and stress every day and see in the military community that are of huge value in America's future if we will sit down and understand what they are and what they mean in the 21st century.
It's great. I'm gonna find out how good of a salesman you are. See if you can convince Taylor to do it. Taylor, what are you doing for the next, what's on your docket? We won't ask you about Pete's idea, but other than that.
Let's see. I am working on a book for a client who is the chairman of the board of a very large defense contractor. And it is a look at character traits of some of our historic figures. I am working on a book about Civil War POWs. And it's going to weave in the personal story of one of our Vietnam POWs who was held in the South. Because the experience of the men held in South Vietnam is very similar to the experience of our Civil War POWs. It was a daily struggle for survival, a daily struggle for survival. Very different experience from the men who were held in the North, in the Hanoi Hilton. Also working on a cold case murder, way outside my wheelhouse. So those are just a few of the projects that I'm working on.
We're going to be following you very closely. Taylor and Pete, how do people find you and stay in touch? I know you've got some web pages, and we're going to put all of this in the show notes, but how do you prefer that people get in touch with you, and are you on social media platforms?
Yes, I have a website, taylorkiland.com, and I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn.
We'll put the links to that. How about Pete? How do folks get in touch with Pete Fretwell?
I am a Luddite. I'm not on any social media, but you're free to post my email address if you'd like. You have it.
Okay, we're going to do that. Well, thank you very much for being our guest today. Our guests have been Taylor Baldwin Kiland and Pete Fretwell, who are the authors, co-authors of Lessons from the Hanoi Hilton, 6 Characteristics of High Performance Teams. And we'll be looking forward to some of your additional writings and be on the lookout for that. Taylor's new book, From the Sea to the C-Suite, certainly sounds interesting. I'm gonna have to pick that up and learn a little bit about Cutler and some of his lessons as well. Hey, you've been listening to the Spotlight on the Veteran Crowd Network. Very pleased to bring guests that are veterans that are making a difference in our community every week via podcast and YouTube. Hey, I want to give a shout out to Taylor and to Pete, an Army Bravo Zulu to you guys, folks. And that's a wrap.
Thank you for listening to Spotlight by VeteranCrowd. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. For more information and uploads, please visit our website at VeteranCrowdNetwork.com. We'll see you next time.